It's great to get you on, Mike. For people who don't know you, you should introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Mike Brock. Obviously, I'm sure it's on the video or the podcast description. I lead our newest business unit at TBD at Block.
At Block, TBD at Block.
Sorry, yeah, yes. At Block, I lead our newest business unit, TBD, which is focused on building on-ramps and off-ramps from what I like to call the old money to new money. New money being Bitcoin and stable coins for creating more financial access all around the world. That's sort of the most pithy way of putting it. In practice, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build open protocols on open standards using open source software in order to solve a lot of the challenges that we see with using these technologies on a day-to-day basis. I think Bitcoin solves the layer one problem really, really well, but there's a whole series of issues that we need to address if we're going to have a more decentralized economy. Identity is a big piece of that. And so we're really focused on building decentralized identity as a tool in order to build more decentralized applications and also allow people to own their own identity on the internet as opposed to giving it up to these like hyperscale platforms that are increasingly being the gatekeepers to our digital life. So that's what we're working on. We think it's critical to Bitcoin adoption long term. And that's what I'm working on. I've been at the company for over 9 years. I was one of the early team members on Cash App. I was the one who brought Bitcoin into Cash App. I also set up our Square crypto division, now known as Spiral. Most of the things we've done at the company with Bitcoin, I've had some hand in. So that's me.
You know a couple of my friends, Miles Suter.
I know Miles really. I hired Miles.
Yeah.
I brought Miles to the company.
And you also know somebody who's played for my football team.
Who's that?
Connor Okus.
I don't think I've ever spoken to him directly, but I know of him.
Yeah, he's at Spiral. He's at Spiral, yeah. Well, like as I said, one of the reasons I wanted to get you on is you can't help, well, you can help in Bitcoin to ignore, not get involved in politics. Plenty of people do. They're like, I don't want to get involved in this shit. I'm about Bitcoin. That's my political affiliation. Everything else is noise. I can't. I get sucked into political discussions, and there is a substantial percentage of people in Bitcoin who are Austrian economists,
yes,
or fans of Austrian economics, who are
very much not a fan.
Yeah, it's in your profile, and who are libertarians, and obviously I've had a lot of those people on my show.
Yeah,
done a number of interviews with people like Eric Voorhees, and he's been very good at challenging my ideas with regards to the state. And I've been sucked down the libertarian rabbit hole a few times, but I never can get there. I've never been able to fully rationalize the kind of end position these people want. And so I've kind of felt a lot on my own sometimes with this because it's quite a rare position to be in. But like I said, I discovered you. I can't remember how, but when I did, I started to realize there's somebody else who can probably do a better job of rationalizing what I'm thinking than I am. But at the same time, I'm going to push back. But you did, it's quite recently I was in a thread with you where you referred to yourself as a reformed libertarian.
Yeah, I call myself post-libertarian.
Okay.
I think it's a pretty common term. I know I have quite a few friends that would use that label as well. So when I was in my early 20s, I was deep within the libertarian movement in Canada. Most of my friends were libertarian. I was part of a cabal of friends. Some of them went on to work at places like the Institute for Humane Studies and the Cato Institute. And I still have a lot of those connections today. A lot of them are like me. They sort of left libertarianism. Some of them followed interesting paths. There was like this weird in-between movement for the post-libertarians. It was called Bleeding Heart Libertarianism, or like BHL. And it was really, some people called it libertarianism. It was an attempt to reconcile the fact that libertarians, particularly in the Cold War period, really got in bed with conservatives in the United States. And it was sort of this like this weird shotgun marriage that was, I don't want to say it was forced on people, but it was rationalized due to the threat of communism around the world, and libertarians were really worried about communism, the Soviet Union, Marxist influences, and they saw conservatives as sort of like a natural ally. And this led to this fusionism where libertarians and conservatives got together and created this sort of weird mess that we see today in the United States with libertarianism and conservatism. And I think especially around the 2008 financial crisis, which was really when I was kind of coming of age and I was still enmeshed in the libertarian movement, that was when there was a lot of conversation starting to happen, among many libertarians of like, why are we friends with conservatives again? Like do we really share the same goals here? Conservatives are generally pro-war. They want to lock nonviolent drug offenders up, send them to jail. They're opposed to immigration. Aren't we against war? Aren't we for immigration? Like, do we really believe that these invisible lines drawn on maps should define whether or not somebody can move around freely and engage in free association? So there was this like real, I think, awakening that happened. And I think that that's kind of what led to at least my post-libertarian journey. I wouldn't like, I think I would say today, I'm still in that tradition in the sense that, I believe in the liberal idea. I believe in, I'm a liberal in the classical tradition, and I love that philosophy, and I'm still a big defender of it, and I'm, and I beat that drum. But I think there's something about what we call libertarianism that is often very reductionist and very suspicious, morally and ethically sometimes. And so I point that out, and I am a someone who really wants to highlight those contradictions. Austrian economics, which is often very closely associated with libertarianism, and I once considered myself an Austrian myself, but as I matured and I started to have a more healthy appreciation for the complexity of the world, I started to see that there were serious blind spots in that way of thinking about the economy and money that I don't think fully and truly capture the complexity of these things. We can get into that. I think it's a really fascinating discussion. I'm happy to go all the way down that rabbit hole and explain in excruciating detail why I think Austrians economists are getting it wrong. But the short and sweet of it is that I don't believe that there is like a true equilibrium to be found in a market, right? I mean, obviously, supply and demand are real. I would never debate that. But like, human society is complicated. What makes us happy is complicated. It's hard to quantify. We're always moving. We're always chasing something new. We're running away from some things. And it's just impossible for me to believe that there's this set of perfect rules that if you follow them, you will achieve this moral maxima, and we will get closer to utopia, I guess, if we just do that. And I doubt that very much. And I think Austrians sometimes are a little bit too utopian in the way they believe that if you subscribe to these like very consistent, self-consistent principles, say like in the Rothbardian sense, referring to Murray Rothbard, that what you'll get is something which is closer to the ideals of freedom and liberty. And there's something suspicious there, which is these like there's normative moral claims at the bottom of what they're saying, and they're not really honest about it. Some people are, but there's this argument of natural laws underneath a lot of those claims that are very suspicious. Like, are those the real natural laws? Like, did it really take until the 20th century for some guy named Murray Rothbard to discover that there were these like laws in the universe that were written in the stars that we just like suddenly discovered and like, oh, this is how we should live? Like laissez-faire economics were like and money and all these like actually relatively advanced social concepts were what we truly needed to achieve like our moral and ethical destiny. Like that can't be true. Like humans have been on this planet for, modern humans anyways, have been on this planet for at least 60,000 years. Our close ancestors, another 200,000 years, primates like several million. Like, this can't be true. It can't be true. So, I'm really suspicious of that way of thinking about the world.
What do you think the attraction is to people who claim to be or claim that they're libertarians?
I think most young people come to libertarianism for the same reason that a lot of young people come to socialism. And a lot of these sorts of really utopian ideologies, because you're young and you're idealistic and you want to believe that there's easy answers. And there's not. There's no easy answers.
I kind of tend to, whenever I sit down with a libertarian, discuss their ideas, I always tend to agree with what they're saying. I think morally they're usually pretty right.
Yeah.
It's when I start to run through the thought experiments of how you coordinate a society of tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people and how that may play out, that's when I start to have questions and start to struggle. I a while back interviewed Scott Horton, and he'd written an article where he said he doesn't believe in the big red button to get rid of government. He doesn't. But what I would worry about is that humans will always coordinate. And if you were to remove the state, something else would replace it that could be worse. And you're a fan of modern liberal.
What is the state? Define the state for me.
I mean,
tell me what the state is.
The state to me is a set of borders that defines a country, and within that there is a group of people who are elected to run it, or maybe not even elected to run it.
So let's like play a little game here, right? Yeah. Like I want to, like let's steel man, like a purely voluntarist society. From the ground up. Let's just do the whole thought experiment today, and then see if we can use purely anarcho-capitalist rules. We'll stick to the non-aggression principle, contractualism, voluntarism, and we'll try to work our way up and see where we get here. So,
but you've already hit one of my first difficult points, is that everyone has to adhere to the non-aggression principle, and humans won't.
Let's give them credit. Let's suspend disbelief, and then try to see if we can, if these ideals can survive. Like, so I'm Bob. So Bob comes along, and Bob sees there's this really, really beautiful island that he wants to buy. I don't know. Maybe it's like 1,000 square miles of island. So he let's just assume for the sake of argument that the island is properly owned. I understand that the proper way in which to obtain the morally pure initial conditions to own land is through homesteading, and so the island was properly homesteaded, and the successor owners were all properly transferred the rights to the island. There's no issues of the island being stolen, or there's no war or anything like that happened. And so Bob is engages in a clean purchase of the island. He owns it outright. It's completely free and open transaction. Bob moves on to the island and decides, you know what? I think it's really boring to live here by myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide my island up into parcels. I'm going to build roads. I'm going to do all this, all the things to attract people to come here and build houses and businesses. And I want to have, Bob's Island, which is going to be the best island to come and do business and raise your family. And in exchange for everyone coming, they have to sign a contract or, some sort of, a 200-year lease to own the land. You agree in this contract that if you come and live on the island, you have to follow Bob's rules. And you sign a contract that Bob is the owner of the island. And so even though you're living here, you have to agree to to do what Bob says. And so, Bob is essentially the CEO of the island. And so Bob's really successful. I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people move to the island. Big companies come and set up shop. Skyscrapers get built. It's this like business paradise. People are loving living on Bob's island. Years and years go by. Bob dies. He leaves the island to his son. His son is like completely crazy, like Mad King type thing. Starts getting into like arguments with some of the big business leaders on the island, and people start getting into conflicts. But as the years go by, the island starts to turn more and more into something that looks like a totalitarian state for all intents and purposes. One day, like one of the families, their 7-year-old kid, like trespasses in the wrong place, smashes a window, and Bob's son, let's call him Peter, tells them the kid they have to remove the kid from the island. I'm like, we have nowhere to go. We have 2 hours to get off my property, or I'm going to go throw you in the ocean, and you can go swim to another shore. And if you take anarcho-capitalism, its principles seriously, nothing unlibertarian is happening. Somebody's just enforcing their property rights. The parents signed a contract. That contract is like, and so are we going to say this isn't a state? What has happened here? We haven't formed a state. This is the regression problem that I see in this anarcho-capitalist argument. So are we going to say that's not, and actually a lot of them will argue it's not a state because, following all these principles, we got to this place by contractualism, voluntarism, non-aggression principle, which now actually defends Peter's island's inheritance. So technically, if he doesn't leave, they're the aggressors. And he's then, of course, under the non-aggression principle, is able to use violence against the 7-year-old to remove him because he's trespassing. So like this is like an example of like why I don't think this ideology is very well thought out. And this is why I asked you at the very beginning there to tell me what a state is. How is that not a state?
But I think it is a state of sorts.
Yeah. But I didn't violate any anarcho-capitalist principle all the way up into the end.
How would you have defended that 20 years ago, or whenever it was you were a libertarian?
I probably would have said, I don't think it's likely to happen. I think I would have probably made some special pleading arguments saying, I think in that world, there'll be competition between jurisdictions. And so people can always leave, and there'll be the incentives of business will never be towards like doing that sort of thing. And I think as I got older and started to really think about human nature and seeing how humans can actually quite regularly act against their own self-interest. They and can be quite malevolent and kind of sociopathic. I came to no longer believe that market forces could not be relied upon to prevent those sorts of outcomes from happening.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but I tend to come at it different ways. I'd had my own thought experiments. But one of the main things was this discussion around freedom, where people would say to me, let's go from first principles. Is coercion right? And I'll be like, no, was there big tax is coercion. Mm-hmm. So why do you believe in the government should tax? Mm-hmm. And when people would come at me with these kind of ideas, I had no decent defense, because otherwise I have to say I believe in coercion. Mm-hmm.
But it's a trap. It's a trap.
It is a trap. But when I kind of worked through the thought experiments, I was like, well, you talk about freedom. I feel very free in the UK. Actually, in Europe, I feel very free. Mm-hmm. I don't feel like I need to have a weapon to protect my home. I can travel quite freely. Everywhere I go, everyone's kind of nice. I feel very safe. And that to me is a certain amount of freedom. Mm-hmm. And the ideas regarding like libertarianism, where you would be able to defend your home and defend your property and have pure freedom, I would question that, and I would say, well, what happens if the guy next door to me has a lot more money, and he just comes and steals my land. I was like, well, you could take him to a arbitration court. I was like, but what if the arbitration court sides with the guy with all the guns and money? There was no like central rule of law. And that's not to say I think the central rule of law is great. That's not to think I don't think there are injustices.
Yeah, of course there are.
But this base set of rules, I feel like, is what is missing from this. And so I've tended to focus more on, I think the libertarians have good ideas. Wouldn't it be great if there were libertarians had more political capital and could have influenced politics? That's where I'd kind of come to.
Yeah, I think libertarians got a lot right. I want to be clear. Like, I don't think that a lot of the libertarian impulses are wrong. I mean, I think libertarians were in some ways ahead of their time on excessive use of police force in the United States. I mean, one great example of that is Radley Balco, right? And his work on really trying to like raise people's awareness about police in the United States using incredibly violent tactics like no-knock raids, dynamic entry raids, to effectuate drug searches, which was which he would refer to as the deadliest tactic in U.S. policing. There's a lot of scary data to like point that out. And this was all pre-Black Lives Matter stuff, where libertarians were like Radley were sort of like shouting from the rooftops to bring attention to the fact that there were aspects of policing in the United States that were like completely out of control in terms of the use of lethal force in situations where it just didn't seem very justified. And so I give libertarians a lot of credit for being early in those discussions. Libertarians have been among the most clear-eyed in terms of the war on drugs over the I'm not like I still like I said, I still have friends who are libertarians, and I consider them really good people. And I'm not anti-libertarian. But I guess like the more accurate way of putting it is that I think it's an incomplete view. It's an incomplete view of how we need to think about this modern society that we're in and all the equities that are involved, and keeping this big complicated game of modern human society together.
Is there a way of completing the view though? Because like I say, I think the influence of libertarians within politics, within government, would be useful for better drug policy, for better policing policy, for a lot of different things with regards to giving, supporting more freedom for the people.
Yeah, I agree. Then the question then becomes, right, and this gets into, what is freedom? I mean, you just gave me one conception of it, which is you feel free to move around, you feel safe. That's a form of freedom. You say you don't have to feel like you have to carry a weapon. Some people, that doesn't feel like a form of freedom.
No, some people want weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be rare in the UK. I don't know, Danny, what do you think? If we had a vote on guns, pro, con?
Maybe 1% pro. Yeah. I mean, I'm pulling that.
And probably every one of those would probably be a British libertarian. Nobody wants guns. It's just nobody wants it. And we want to keep our National Health Service, despite criticisms of that. We just don't want it. Now, one or two people listening will write to me and go, "You're wrong, I do." But like, generally speaking, we do not want weapons. That said, if I came to live here, I wouldn't be anti-gun. Yeah. It's just a different culture.
Yeah, and I don't think that people want to get rid of the state either. Like I don't know where people see evidence for that. I think that's another, and not all libertarians do, by the way. Sometimes it seems like that.
Smaller.
Yeah, it's a smaller percentage of that, but like,
no, they want a smaller state.
They want a smaller state. But the reality is that most people want some form of welfare state. I mean, even most Republicans in the United States, which Republicans are typically seen as the small government party that is anti-welfare, but they're the ones who added Medicare Part D. They expanded Social Security. Like, the reality is that, and they know that because they know that Republican voters, by and large, want to maintain the welfare state. And so, like, I don't know. I think you need. I think Milton Friedman was probably put it best, right? Like, if we're not going to be able to get rid of the welfare state, whether some people want to or not, for moral or ethical reasons, we might as well make it work better, right? Because people don't want to get rid of it. And I think that's where, like, my head is at on those sorts of things. I mean, I think in the US it's crazy. We have, like, I don't know how many types of federal welfare programs there are. It's very inefficient. But this conception that we're all going to sort of move to a more laissez-faire world where it's more sink or swim, rely on charities and churches and community organizations to help people who can't help themselves, as opposed to the government. There's no political constituency for that. Like, that's real.
Well, I haven't ever actually researched if there's background data on this, but I would love to see the data on those countries that have a welfare state and the percentage of GDP that goes towards that, and then any associated stats with regards to standard of living or lifetime expectancy. I mean, I've traveled to countries that have no welfare state, and there are horrendous ghettos, and it's not just about being fair. It is actually, it brings more risk to those who the haves from the have-nots. So I don't know that data. I'm sure Danny's having a look at it now, but I'm quite proud to look. Like, for at the moment in the UK, we have a massive what's seen as an immigration problem, and 40,000 people this year have crossed from France essentially on dinghies, risking their lives to come to the UK. I'm proud as a country that we actually try and find a way to accept them into the country and can provide them perhaps with housing and support and food, and to give them a chance to have a leg up in society. I like that. But I don't like the idea of being challenged that I'm anti-freedom because of that.
How is that being anti-freedom?
Well, because that's paid for by your tax, and that tax is theft. What have we got here?
This is just the healthcare spending. I can't find anything with as a percentage of GDP.
That's healthcare spending, but it's not kind of like, I'm thinking more like tax and standard of living.
Okay.
Look at that. Isn't that insane how much the US spends on healthcare?
It's actually really crazy.
Yeah. I've got to experience both the UK and the US healthcare system recently. I've talked about this on the show. I have this thing called where I get an SVT and my heart rate just goes crazy sometimes. And the symptoms are like a heart attack. And so when we were in Miami recently, my lips all went cold. It all happened. Danny took me to emergency care in the US. And a lot was very similar, but there were a couple of things that stood out to me. The hospital itself was more run down than a UK hospital, which surprised me. The wait time was exactly the same. It was a 4 to 5 hour experience, but I was given way more tests in the US, and they gave me some drugs to take at the end, whereas in the UK, they essentially do an ECG and one blood test or a couple of blood tests. And that really stood out to me, is that it doesn't matter whether it was private or social, the kind of experience was pretty much the same. But because of the risk of litigation in the US, they did a lot more checks.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm originally from Canada, so
Right.
I've experienced the healthcare system on both sides of the border. And yeah, I mean, there are differences. I mean, I would say emergency care in the US and Canada is pretty comparable. It's pretty much a very similar experience if you end up in an emergency room, where things are probably a little bit better in the US, but what we pay for it is like access to specialists. The famous example in Canada is like knee replacement surgery. Wait times for that are anywhere from 6 months to a year. If you need a knee replacement, many Canadians end up, because they're in so much pain, coming south of the border to get it done out of pocket, which is very, very expensive without insurance.
We had a Canadian guy in here the other day whose friend was going through the exact same thing and said the waiting list is 18 months for an ACL replacement.
Yeah.
Because of the backlog from COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an example a bit, but yeah, I mean, if you have a heart attack in Canada, I mean, you'll get relatively the same level of care you will in the US. It's when you're dealing with non-life threatening conditions, that's when you really feel the way that the care is rationed. And that's the biggest difference. And so there are trade-offs.
We also have it with top-end cancer treatment. A lot of people in the UK, you regularly see it. Someone's fundraising to send their child for leukemia treatment in the US because
Yeah.
the top end care is better,
Yeah.
and there are certain conditions that are considered curable here that aren't considered in the UK. I mean, one of my best friends, he brought his son out here when I think he was about 8, and he was cured of cancer. I'm pretty sure it was leukemia he had, and he was cured. And I think that is one of the successes of having a more capitalist healthcare system, in that there's a financial incentive to solve those high-end items. But at the same time, in the UK, if you have a heart attack, you're not going to get a big bill and be financially crippled for maybe even the rest of your life. I kind of like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's some evidence too that it's like, I mean, there's obviously going to be a drag on the economy from employers having to cover the cost of healthcare as opposed to it being amortized, across the whole population through like government programs. I think that's true. But I mean, so yeah, I'm with you. Like, I think that like most people in the United States want that, right? Like, I mean, it was just a midterm election and another red state just expanded, opted into the Medicare expansion again. So,
which state was that?
I can't remember which one it was. Was it Kentucky? Or don't quote me. I don't remember, but one of the states just did, as part of a ballot measure.
Does the Medicare system work?
I mean,
is it effective?
Well, Medicare is for like once you reach like retirement age in the United States, you essentially gain access to a federally run single payer system we call Medicare. And then there's Medicaid, which is another version for people who are below the poverty line.
Which was the one that just expanded?
I think it was a Medicare and Medicaid expansion, if I'm correct, but we can fact check that.
Why do you think there is that significant connection between, especially in the Bitcoin world, there is a connection between right-wing politics and libertarians? Do you think it's economics driven?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's this element. I think it's one of the more unfortunate aspects of libertarian politics that a friend of mine used to call the thin economic wedge in libertarian politics, where there's this real obsession that liberty is downstream of economic liberty. It's a very curious claim, like similar to the claim of self-ownership, which we can talk about too. Because I don't think economic freedom is different from social freedom. Economic freedom is a social freedom. Name one economic transaction you can think of that is not that is not a social act. Buying a coffee is a social act. We're engaged in a social act. Advertising is a social act. Even going and seeing a sports event or buying gas at the gas station is a social act. None of these things happen without some social freedom. So separating social freedom, and I think when people try to separate that, they're thinking in terms of things like same-sex marriage or like the ability to use recreational drugs. Those are sort of the typical things people think of when they think social freedom versus like economic freedom. I think it's a really silly distinction because those things also implicate economic freedom. I mean, particularly on the same-sex marriage side, there's aspects of the tax system that specifically advantages those who can get married. You can jointly file your taxes, or if recreational drug use, there's real businesses that can exist there versus otherwise can't. So thinking about these things as separate is one weird thing that I think happens sometimes with libertarians, where they're like, look, I don't really care about social freedoms. If I have all my economic freedoms, then the social freedoms will come. And then my response is like, well, why do you think that? Like people used to point to Hong Kong and Singapore and even mainland China as examples of like, they're even more capitalist than the United States. Well, yeah, maybe that's true in some sense, but would you want to live under a surveillance state like this with these crazy like systems like the social credit system and omnipresent surveillance online through like completely government controlled internet. Like, I mean, like the reality is that like there is no separation between economic and social freedom. If there's social control, there's economic control, because all economic activity is downstream of social freedom and our ability to, effectuate things through social means. And so I think that is just a fallacious way of thinking, where people they say that it kind of makes sense. They have these like few examples in their head of what economic freedoms are and a few examples in their head of what social freedoms are. And they haven't really thought about it too deeply. And they spend about 5 seconds thinking about it, and then they cut off their thought process. But if you think about it enough, you realize that you should probably care a lot more about social freedom if you're a libertarian, because that's the real way that your rights will get pulled out from underneath you, including your economic rights.
Yeah, I've had a couple of clashes with people recently, people who would claim they're a freedom maximalist, who express kind of bigoted views towards gender freedoms, sexual freedoms, and I've kind of got sucked into that. I would say the Conservative Party has pushed a lot back on the advancement of freedoms we've seen for people related to gender and sex, and I think some of the pushback has potentially been fair, or there's certain things that can be challenged. But at the same time, I don't understand somebody who claims to be a freedom maximalist who is triggered by the idea of same-sex relationships, marriages.
It's very strange.
Yeah,
it's very strange because you often find with like extreme libertarians, there's this sort of sense of like, I just want to be left alone by the state, but then objecting to people who are now being left alone by the state to do things that like, they want to do, like with their bodies. They want to present themselves as a different gender, or like they want to like love someone of the same sex. Like that like exactly right. Like I think when you pull back the layers of the onion on that, what you find is they really just only care about like, a very narrow set of economic goals. Keep as much money as they possibly can. They don't want it taxed. But generally speaking, like they have very like socially conservative like goals. This actually speaks to another element of libertarianism, and I sent out a tweet on this the other day, which is a true story about how I left libertarianism, and what was like the actual straw that broke the camel's back was this sort of realization that I came to having a conversation with someone, that they saw like this person was starting to talk in ways that were suspiciously sounding bigoted and quite frankly racist. And I remember asking him straight up, I said, it really sounds to me like what you're really concerned about here is you want to use property rights in their most strict sense as an excuse to like basically like create like an all-white community and society. And he says to me, he says, what's the problem with that, right? I have a right to do business with whoever I want. And I was like, well, I'm like, and then I remember he like started jumping down my throat and said, it's like, if you are a libertarian and you believe in property rights, you can't tell me what I can and cannot do with my property. And I realized in that moment that like for him, libertarianism was about the right to put up a whites only sign in the storefront and then call it property rights. And that was a absolutely it was like an earth-shattering moment for me. And I remember like I was in a group of people, and people were getting really mad at me that I was pushing back at this guy, and I didn't really understand why. And people were like, "Well, what are you saying? The state's going to basically tell people they can't put up whites-only signs in their storefront because that would be a violation of property rights. How can you be a libertarian and like support that?" and you're like, wait, like, why is this so important to you guys? Like, why is the line in the sand that you want to draw here? And I just remember like going home after this and being like, holy crap. And like, I can't associate with these people. And I remember being really depressed and feeling like completely politically listless. It actually took me kind of a year. Like I kind of like left my whole sort of political consciousness behind. I dove like into my work and I stopped really thinking about politics day to day. Then I went back and I started like reading the classics again, and I got into sort of, liberal philosophy again. And that's how I kind of get to where I am today. But do you
think it's because maybe they want to defend the most extreme version of, say, property rights to protect all property rights? A bit similar to like the NRA. They don't give an inch on anything.
I think there are people like that.
Yeah.
I think there's a slippery slope fallacy going on there.
Yeah.
But I think there were really people there that saw this as like a way to, they saw it as a vehicle for bigotry. They really did. And it's not surprising to me that like a lot of these people who I knew would, like after 2016, just took the mask off. They just took the mask off.
It reminds me of that Jordan Peterson video.
Which one's that?
With the comedian interviews him.
Oh, yes.
Have you seen this video?
No.
The Australian guy.
Yeah, with the Australian comedian. So it was when Jordan Peterson was discussing the idea of the cake shop. Do you know when the cake shop? Can somebody who owns a cake shop refuse to serve somebody who's gay because
this is like a famous case, yeah.
Yeah, but you've not seen Jordan Peterson discuss it.
I have not seen Jordan Peterson discuss it.
And actually, I credit Jordan Peterson for his reaction, but it helped me understand why. It helped me understand why part of these kind of ideas with regards to property rights and free speech don't work. You got it?
Yeah.
Making people bake a cake for a gay wedding.
Making them do it?
Yeah.
I don't think that's a very good idea.
But here's the argument. So should they be able to deny making a cake for a black couple if they don't like black people?
Allowed to? Probably. That doesn't mean it's right.
Okay, so then we had the civil rights movement where they said black people, you had to serve them in your restaurants and stuff like that. And it did work and it did make our society better. But would you argue that that still wasn't right?
No, that was right.
Why is that different to now if you didn't want to make a cake for black people?
Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not different. Yeah. Maybe I was wrong about that.
So I credit him with actually admitting he was wrong.
Yeah.
But you go through those thought experiments and I think some of these ideas fall apart. And I think personally, I like the idea of how we work out, how we coordinate as a society. Because I think if we don't figure that out, we just end up with something that's worse. And whether that's worse because we have less care or less social coordination, or we just end up with some new kind of authoritarian structure that comes in its place that fills a vacuum. Yeah. That's what I always worry about. But then get challenged on the idea of like, should there be hate speech laws? We have them in the UK, and I think sometimes they've been used ineffectively. Mm-hmm. So I kind of get lost.
Some of them are pretty scary, actually, in the UK. Like
do you know about the comedian with the dog?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff you guys do in the UK with these like anti-social behavior orders and stuff like that is actually for me is like a little bit too far. I'm actually more libertarian than that even.
Yeah.
So we could talk about that, but like I think though, look, I think that we have figured out a really good system. Right. And I think liberal democracy is the best thing that we currently have on offer in terms of like trying to build a society that tries to create a system in which like we can try to find some balance between all these things we're talking about, like making sure that like the people who are down on their luck don't like end up dead in a gutter, or making sure that like our government and our leaders can be held accountable. We do that at the ballot box, right? With electoral democracy, and making sure that like the government can't go too far. We do that with like placing a liberal conception of rights as a constraint on what the government can do. You know, that kind of started with the Magna Carta back in the UK, like hundreds of years ago. The U.S. Constitution was like another major step, and many other countries have adopted constitutions and human rights charters and stuff like that to try and codify that. And I think what can we agree on? I can agree that we should not have tyrannical majorities that are running roughshod over minorities. We should not have government with unchecked power. If government is going to have power over us, they have to be accountable to us. They have to be transparent. These are all things that we figured out. And what's really frustrating about living in 2022 is the fact that there's this sense that everything has failed. The whole system has failed. Democracy has failed. Liberalism has failed. We need something new. I don't think that's true. I think we've just gotten really lazy about fighting for, these systems, fighting for the systems of democracy, fighting for liberal values. It kind of feels like maybe a little bit especially in the recent months now, that maybe that zeitgeist has shifted, and that gives me a little bit of hope. But I don't what is it about that's so offensive to some people in this space? A liberal democracy, it's so weird. I feel like in some of these conversations, it's almost it feels like sacrilege to even say you support these things.
I think because historically you can point to a number of things that the state has done, which is not great, which is locking up people in jail, which is unnecessary wars in the Middle East and various other places. It is massive surveillance. Yeah. I think there's plenty
of
things
have happened.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of reasons to look at them and say, this is a problem. This isn't good. Mm-hmm. I'm just not the one who thinks we should burn it all down. I actually love. I love that you brought this up, because what you say is what those criticisms are true. Right. I mean, we talked about one of them earlier when I was talking about Radley Balco and police excesses. You brought up, foreign wars. The Iraq War of 2003 comes to mind as something that's when I think about it, it's enraging to think that actually happened, and that the people who perpetrated it, haven't been held accountable for it. Those things are all true, but I think if you're going to do this, you have to engage in a little bit of counterfactual reasoning, right? What is the real alternative, right, to trying to go forward and trying to reform and trying to make the future better? The reality is we're a very flawed species. We always have been. We've done all these bad things, but human beings, en masse, have done really bad things for thousands of years, right? Up until the last couple hundred years, slavery was actually legal in most places in the world. We forget about this. There's an embarrassing legacy in the United States of slavery, and we should be embarrassed by that legacy, and we should be learning about that legacy. But let's if we take human history as a total view on human history, humanity has been pretty shitty to itself. We've fought wars, many wars, not just the Iraq War, but insane war, World War I. I've studied it, and I'm still not quite clear on what happened there. It's the weirdest thing that ever happened in the 20th century that led to millions of deaths. And so we have the capacity to be very shitty, but we also have a capacity to be very beautiful. Right? We've gotten progressively better. There's another way of looking at our history. There's another way of looking at where we've come from, right? Slavery is not legal anymore. Same-sex marriage is legal. We have most Americans today, if you poll them, think the Iraq War was a mistake. That's progress of a kind. The fact that that people realize that these mistakes have happened. So this idea that what are we going to do? We're going to anthropomorphize countries and say, well, you did this, and so these sins are attached to you, and so we have to somehow punish the
the state, which isn't even a thing. It's just like a conglomeration of a whole bunch of people working together and reacting to incentives. And it's like the state isn't, it's just an idea. It's just a concept. It's just us following a bunch of rules we wrote down on a piece of paper. Like it's not like the United States is not a person that's guilty of something, right? Like, I mean, I think a lot of us think like that as like a mental shortcut. And I know why we do, because it's like a useful abstraction, but like it doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't tell you what, I mean, if you do think like that, then yeah, we should take the United States out back and we should execute it for its crimes. But it's not, but the United States isn't a person. It's not like and it doesn't make sense to think of it that way.
I think there's parts of what the United States has done by creating this kind of like, maybe this is one area you agree with and why you're a fan of Bitcoin, but created this global reserve currency. Are you friends with Alex Gladstein?
Yeah.
Okay.
Him and I are, yeah, we had dinner just the other night.
Oh, great. So I'm going to bore people on the show because I keep mentioning this at the moment, but it just tends to happen when you have an important show. We made a show about, did he talk to you about his paper he's working on the World Bank and the IMF?
Yeah.
So we made a show on that. And then, a lot of the ability for not just the USA, I mean, Europe and other Western liberal democracies, the ability for them to be able to have progress and create this high standard of living is this kind of economic imperialism that they've imposed on the rest of the world. Things like that, again, like they're not good. Mm. And we're in agreement on this. So my question there really would be, well, what are the reforms then that we want? Mm. What are the reforms that would be good, that would kind of end some of the things we've perpetrated on the rest of the world, or even in our own societies? Because that's where I'm more comfortable, is not to burn it all down, it's to say, look, okay, democracy has its challenges. How can we improve things?
Yeah, so it's funny. Alex and I actually had this conversation over dinner.
Great.
And we were talking about the World Bank and the IMF. And he had asked me like how I thought about it. And I got into talking a little bit about, if we're going to get a little bit sort of sociological and philosophical here, is like, the way I look at a lot of these things is there's path dependence issues, right? That get us to like where we are today. I think there's like, it's very true that the World Bank and the IMF have done quite a bit of damage in terms of like enmeshing the global South in debt, and then giving them more debt to pay off, older debt, and have created like what is like something that is, I mean, is morally problematic, to say the least. And yeah, like, I mean, I think like Gladstein's message on this around Bitcoin being this emancipatory force here to allow people and countries to take control of their own destiny is certainly something that I support and I'm in agreement with. I think it's, I think that when you look at like, how did we get here, right? Like, I think that there's a lot of road to hell being paved by good intentions there. I think there's probably were some starry-eyed people along the way. Like I'm not a conspiracy theorist, right? Like I believe that one of the reasons why like Nixon originally like broke down and went to China and started to normalize relations, and the fact that Thatcher handed Hong Kong back over to China was a belief that through engagement and through like economic development that China in particular would liberalize over time as a result of like economic reforms. And I think the World Bank and the IMF have tried to follow a similar script, hoping that like through economic investment that a lot of these countries would reap the benefits of market economies. They would like become more productive. They would be able to pay back these loans, and they would become more like liberal democracies that were more wealthy. What ended up happening though was like, a lot of these governments were corrupt. They embezzled a lot of the money, didn't make it to the people, didn't actually turn into investments at all. Infrastructure wasn't built. If it was like purely in service of just like, setting up mines that were exporting raw materials back, yes, like to like first world countries. But like, I do think that like two things are true. One, these systems were set up with people who were starry-eyed about the power of like economic reforms and market economies that would actually lift people out of poverty worldwide. And by the way, like market reforms have lifted billions of people out of poverty. Let's like be very clear. But like we didn't spend enough time like advancing the cause of freedom, liberty, and democracy. We actually, what happened was we had a neoliberal movement in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s in particular that felt if we could just like jumpstart capitalism around the world, we would then like democracy and liberalism would follow. And I think what happened with the World Bank and the IMF had a lot to do with that. And we reached this point where we are today, where we're looking at it now and we're like, well, holy crap! Like, it hasn't done that. It's made these countries, it's actually made them even more dependent on foreign aid over time. They haven't developed their economies. Their governments are corrupt, and that corruption is being reinforced by these regimes that we've created. And so it's like, yeah, like it's a moral dilemma that we have to take on. And so I agree that like we need people to realize that, and we need to start taking positive steps towards like including billions of people on this planet that simply do not have access to what we do sitting here at this table.
Back to my question on reforms though, what do you believe needs reforming?
What do I think we could
you might not have done this.
We could be here for the next 5 hours. What do I believe needs reforming? Like specifically with the IMF or the World Bank?
No, more with domestic politics to begin with. Just to give, I think there's a lot of kind of nihilism at the moment. I think people are losing faith in the ability, what their vote actually does or means.
Yeah. So
politics seems to be attracting shit people. And I think good people avoid it because they don't want to have their lives destroyed. I mean, at the moment in the UK, it's just like, we don't have the two-party politics issues that you have here in the US. We just have fucking wankers in politics, just absolute, like people you don't want to vote for. It's like Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. I couldn't vote for him. And, we've had 4 prime ministers in the last couple of years in the Conservative Party. I mean, Boris Johnson, by the way, who used to claim he's a libertarian. He's not. He was just a conservative. We've had Liz Truss, destroyer of economy. We have Rishi Sunak at the moment, who is very authoritarian in the way he speaks at times. There's no one to vote for. Mm-hmm. And it's no one to believe in or get behind. There's no one to look up to.
Yeah, I think it's, yes, I mean, if you want democracy to survive, people have to have a perception that government is responsive to their needs and is like paying attention to the things that they care about. And I think, that nihilism you speak of, I'm raging against that all the time, because the reality is that we're the problem. We're the problem with democracy. I'm the problem with democracy. We're all the problem with democracy, right? This idea that it's just the politicians' fault. I mean, that can't be true, right? I mean,
we keep voting for them.
We keep voting for them, and we can stand for election. And I think we need to reinvigorate people's belief in that. Political change can happen. And it has, right? The UK was an economic basket case in the 1970s, right? And of course, Thatcher came in and reformed the UK economy. She broke the back of the trade unions. I mean, which was a very difficult period for the UK. But the UK went on to a massive economic boom. The next 20 years in the UK was impressive in terms of how much economic development happened after that. So, I mean, the reality is that we can make things better. We can, and we have. This idea that we're stuck, the system has failed, it can't go any further, it's a false despair. It's within the power of all of us to do this. And I guess like all I can do is keep screaming from the rooftops that like, yes, we should all care about democracy. We should all, if we want something to happen, then we should identify candidates that support our points of view on those things, and we should try to elevate them. We can donate money. We can support we should at some point get to like how Bitcoin can help with democracy, because I think it can.
Wow, that was on my next question.
But yeah, but I think that, that's the double-edged sword of democracy. If you engage, then democracy will respond to that engagement. If you disengage, then special interests and nefarious interests and malevolent interests will capture the politicians. They'll capture politics, and we will have governments that are not responsive to the wants and desires and needs of the people who they govern. It's that simple.
Do you want a whiskey?
Yeah, I'm down for it.
All right. Look at that. We have alcohol for everyone.
Perfect.
All right. So, cheers,
Matt.
So what does Bitcoin mean to you? And I put that question to you because, again, like based on the questions that come at me, it's like, you're a statist. You don't even understand.
I don't agree.
You're a statist.
I hate that term. That is a pejorative term.
Danny tells me off even referring to myself, but they're like, you're a statist. You don't even understand Bitcoin. If you understood Bitcoin, you wouldn't be a statist. And I'm like, because as far as I'm aware, Bitcoin for me was peer-to-peer electronic money that routes around the control of anyone. But I don't remember any time, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't read all Satoshi's write-ins, but he said he created Bitcoin to get rid of government. It was to get rid of central banking. So, and I'm okay with that. I don't think that's a bad idea. We had the elimination of church and state, and I think the elimination of money and state should be debated. But at the moment, I have plenty of uses for Bitcoin that materially improve my life within the sphere of democracy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to bring up Alex Gladstein again, I think, the work that he's doing at the Human Rights Foundation with Bitcoin, pursuing the cause of democracy. I mean, in places that where it seems hopeless, and the way that Bitcoin is being used by human rights activists and democracy activists, and in Africa, in Russia, in the case of Alexei Navalny's organization, the Anti-Corruption Foundation. These are like real ways that today that Bitcoin is being used to advance the cause of freedom and democracy. So that's very real. And I want to give a shout out to Alex Gladstein again and the amazing work he is doing at the HRF on that. Now, in terms of like where we end up and whether or not money and the state ever end up getting completely separated, I'm a bit skeptical that will ever quite really happen. I am one of those people who is sort of accepts the reality that I think credit will continue to be a very dominant form of money, whether or not it's denominated in Bitcoin or not, whether or not Bitcoin ever becomes a unit of account. One thing I believe, though, is that Bitcoin really changes the incentives in a really, really dramatic way for if central banks continue to exist and continue to issue, state money like fiat currency, they will have to do so in a world where an off-ramp to Bitcoin is going to be omnipresent, where they're going to have to think about the mechanics of how their currency works. And it's going to be a lot easier in the future for people to lose trust in alternative currencies if Bitcoin becomes an omnipresent global currency.
It's like another check and balance.
It's a check and balance, and we should want that, right? Like we don't like I said, I'm a small liberal, and the purpose of democracy is to give power to the people. It's not to give power to the government, right? The government is there to provide protection, to provide a common set of rules and laws so we can all be more free, so we don't have to worry about, you said earlier, like worrying about your safety and having to carry a gun, like to protect yourself at every moment of the day. Like safety is a form of freedom. I agree with that. I'm with you on that. And like, those are the sorts of things we want government to do. Things we don't want government to do is to come into our bedroom, to tell us like, you know, like where we can work and where we can't, and where we can move, where we can live, and like who we can be friends with and who we can associate. When government starts doing those things, then like I'm going to start sounding a lot like a crazy libertarian / anarchist too, right? Like I believe that there are limits to the power of government. And I think, yeah, we're moving into a scary world where the digital sphere is a double-edged sword. And we see both sides of those swords. On one side, we see it with Bitcoin, the democratizing power of it, the ability to return power to individuals in a way where governments can't control it, corporations can't control it. But then we see the other side of that sword with technology, with like really scary Orwellian surveillance states like China. Technology is very dangerous.
Or
very helpful. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, like the
NSA.
The NSA. I mean, the things that Edward Snowden exposed. I mean, these programs appeared to me, anyways, to be unconstitutional, contrary to what U.S. law appears to allow for. So, a government
Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, government breaking the law is a serious problem for democracy. Government should always be below the law. And so, yeah, like we need to start thinking about ways that we return power to people. And Bitcoin is super compelling in that regard. And it's one of the ways that I think we can really start to hopefully bend the course of history back to some balance where government is more responsive to us, more responsive because they realize that we have power to choose where we save our money, how we spend our money. I think like I think I'm more on Andrew Bailey's side of this, that like I think Bitcoin may incentivize states to be a lot more responsible with fiat currency. And I said this at
I agree with that.
And I said this at Bitcoin Miami earlier this year, as I think ironically Bitcoin may be the thing that saves fiat from itself, because it creates this sort of check and balance where governments are going to continue to want it because so they can tax, you know, in that currency, because they want to maintain a welfare state and they want to be able to like issue bonds for capital investments to build bridges and roads and stadiums and all these other things. And so I think there'll be a great incentive for governments to try and maintain the power to issue fiat, but I don't think they'll be able to do it at the levels of irresponsibility that we've seen over the last 20 years. Like what we saw happen at the late 90s and early 2000s, and how we've blown up these asset bubbles with incredibly easy money policies, zero interest rate policies, that like we see it, like we see these graphs from like the St. Louis Fed, and like we're like, what like this can't, like how can this?
Or what we saw yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, we were looking at a chart. We were looking at the debt clocks. It's scary things. I mean, I've always had a very simple way of explaining this. Is this how I explain Bitcoin to people and why it matters? I said, if I ask somebody about their budget, when you get paid at the end of the month, what do you do? And it's you pay for your house and your car, and you put money by for your food, and you maybe some for a holiday. You have a little bit left over. I said, well, what happens if you go over budget? I said, well, maybe I'll get a loan. I said, well, what happens if you don't pay the loan back? I said, well, they take my house off me. I was like, well, what if you had a printer up in your room and you could just keep printing money and kicking the can down the road? It's like, well, I would print that money. Well, that's exactly what we've given government.
Yep.
Now, if you took that ability to print money away, I believe the government would run a budget and they would have to stay within budget. They would have no choice because they don't have the ability to print money. And
no, they would still take on debt.
They could take on debt.
Yeah, but they would still borrow against the future.
But they could be bankrupted easier.
Yes.
And we know the US government is running the risk of default. There is a potential in our lifetime of a US government default.
Oh, there's certainly a potential there. I mean, the sovereign debt risk in the United States is rising. It's troubling. I don't think we're near it now, but it like you can see how it could happen now. And that's scary. But
they should, if you look at the budget now, they should be slashing the military spend, they should be slashing social security spend, and they should be running a budget. to me, that is natural. And
I think it's inevitable that taxes are going to go up in this country, and people don't want to hear me say that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I mean, they're going to go up in the UK at the moment.
Yeah, it's inevitable.
Yeah. I mean, we had Liz Truss try the opposite, which was to reduce taxes and increase spending, and she blew up the pension market. Now we've been told that we're going to see higher taxes and slash spending, which is sadly exactly what is required to get back to trying to balance the budgets as close as we can.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will eventually reach that point. I mean, I lived through a little bit of that when I was younger, right? And growing up in Canada in 1993, the Canadian government's debt to GDP ratio got frighteningly high. The government was 6 months away from default. A lot of people don't realize this, but the Liberal Party had won an election in 1993, deposing the Progressive Conservative Party. It was one of the greatest electoral defeats in the history of the country. I think the PCs were reduced to 2 seats in the parliament. It was a massive majority.
Sounds like
the Liberals had run they had this little they had an election platform called the Red Book, and it was like all the crazy things they were going to do and all these social services. And when John Chrétien became prime minister, Paul Martin became the finance minister, they realized that they were in a lot of trouble. You know, the country was in recession, and when they started to realize that the bond markets were moving against Canada and the cost of borrowing was spiraling out of control, Canada underwent what a lot of people at the time saw as there were protests and public sector unions were protesting right, left, and center, but the federal public sector spending fell by 40%. By the end of the decade, because it had to. The government saw the end was nigh, and the country had to go through some pretty painful adjustments. Taxes had, the sales tax, federal sales tax was imposed. The GST that actually did happen at the end of the previous government. Chrétien had actually promised to get rid of this 7% federal sales tax that was imposed, but then he kind of realized he couldn't get rid of it because it was like one of the few lifelines that was bringing in enough funds. But I was much younger then, but I think the United States is headed for a moment like that, where there's one day someone's in the Treasury Department's going to be looking at some spreadsheet on their computer, and they're going to realize, hopefully when they're not too late, that something has really got to change and fast, or the United States is going to be in a lot of trouble.
Well, like I say, the UK is exactly the same. Danny, it's another Canadian.
Another Canadian.
It's 3 Canadians. Yeah, it's been a week of Canadians. Somehow, have we been kind of group attacked? Have we been Sybil attacked by the Canadians?
I'm also an American citizen.
I'm
a dual citizen.
All right, fair enough. So when you think about Bitcoin, then what are the important things for you? You see everything debated on Bitcoin Twitter, crypto Twitter. What are the things you care about now?
I care about building transactional utility for Bitcoin. I care about Lightning, continue to develop Lightning and address the challenges there. I care about building decentralized identity in order to enable more robust self-custody scenarios. I think that finding ways to make Bitcoin relevant to people's daily life, as opposed to just something that you trade on an exchange and draw fancy lines on charts and try to figure out is the bottom in yet? Is this the top? Is this the reversal? I think this is a head and shoulders pattern. This is
cross.
Yeah, the death cross. This is something which I am very much uninterested in. I'm really interested in building infrastructure on top of Bitcoin that can ultimately bring a better experience than we have today in fiat. This is my realization as a product person. I worked on Cash App for nearly a decade, and my learning is that it's not enough it's not enough to be better. Certainly it's not enough to be better just because of principles like decentralization or censorship resistance. I mean, these are not the reasons why people will use Bitcoin. I mean, if people think that people will use Bitcoin because it's decentralized and censorship resistant, then I have serious questions about like why TikTok continues to be the fastest growing application, social media application, given the fact that, you know, it certainly is not decentralized and it's certainly not censorship resistant. It's in the media all the time that the Chinese government has its hands all over that application. You and me are weird. Like, we care about this stuff a lot. Like I care about like the properties of decentralization and censorship resistance and the fact that it's outside of the control of the state. My daughter doesn't care about that. My wife doesn't understand it, or she doesn't care about that. And this is me, and they're living with me, right? And they're kind of representative. And I think that this is something that, like, it informs my work. To me, TBD is like very much about like first principles. How do we build products and services that are easier to use? They're more approachable, they're safer, they're cheaper, they're faster than what people are using today. And that's to me is what this industry, if there is an industry to be called the Bitcoin industry, that has to be where the focus is. It cannot be on like, you know, number go up. People got mad at me. I tweeted out that number go up is not a use case, and a whole bunch of people got mad at me and said, "Well, that's not true because that's like savings." And I was like, but I think, okay, maybe I'm willing to concede the point a little bit, like that as a savings vehicle, like it's good. It's just not enough. That's not going to sustain it. Like artificial scarcity is not enough to sustain something. I can create artificial scarcity anywhere for any reason, right? Like I can come up with arbitrary rules. Like people do it all the time. They're trying to create these new cryptocurrencies that we all call shit coins and stuff. But like, so artificial scarcity is just not enough of an incentive to make it work. The good news is Bitcoin already has really substantial market effects in place, like substantial liquidity all around the world. We can build payment systems on top of it. We can build remittance solutions on top of Bitcoin. We can secure digital identity with Bitcoin. You know, we're doing that with Ion. And so these are all the things that like people need to be focused on in this space if they want to see this future, if they want to see that future where Bitcoin is a check and balance on the excesses of government, if they want to make sure that like Bitcoin is this emancipatory force that allows us to return economic power and political power, maybe ultimately to individuals, particularly in the cases of those people who are fighting for their right to be free in the first place, especially with the work that Alex Gladstein is doing, you know, at the HRF. And I think that's how we have to think about it. And so I try really, really hard to avoid talk about the price. Like I try not to care about it. I try to be very dismissive about the price of Bitcoin on any given day, because it's such a distraction to the hard work that needs to be done if we're going to build a new financial system around Bitcoin, which I want to do. It's what I'm doing like every single day at TBD.
We don't really talk about price on the show anymore. We don't make price shows. We used to make like once a month show with Willy Woo. We don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I don't do that.
And it was a different reason we stopped it. We stopped it because we wanted to do all our interviews in person. But now we wouldn't go back to that. I mean, we'd maybe do a one-off with Willy.
Yeah.
But actually he talks about other interesting things anyway. Back to your point whereby, you know, people are not going to use Bitcoin because it's decentralized or censorship resistance. It's more of a point they can use it because it is. There's certain people out there who can use it because of that, which is great. But I get it. I'm with you. Like I'm beyond hodl now. I think hodl's great if you're new, and it's a great meme for trying to get people to forget about, you know, the volatility in price. I'm now about utility. I want to use it. We use it for our football club. We got all our merch here. We're selling it at the event, and people were paying in Bitcoin. We hold that Bitcoin. I now spend Bitcoin when I wouldn't, and I want to spend it because I see it more as a revolution, and to be part of the revolution, I got to contribute. So me starting to use it rather than focusing on every bit of Bitcoin, what it was worth in the future, means I'm contributing to that revolution. That's a really important part to me. And, we need people to use it, because if more people use it, more people need it, the price will go up, which will allow things like mining to expand, which will allow education resources to expand. Like, the network effect creates all these kind of perpetual loops of spread of information. So I'm really in the camp of wanting to use it. I want more use cases for it. I want it to be better. I don't know what they are. Because how can it, if you had, even though I prefer using Lightning from Visa, how can it be better? In the end, a transaction is a tap or it's a tap. How can it be better? What more can it do? It can maybe go across border easier. Yeah,
I not to toot my own horn a little bit here, but I think that the way it's going to feel better is when we really solve decentralized identity and verifiable credentials. Man,
Jeremy loves this stuff.
Yeah, as like a base, like when we solve that problem, and we're able to use that as sort of the way in which we mediate transactions, and then you can really start thinking about like self-custody scenarios that feel as good, if not easier, than like custodial scenarios or using your Amex card or your Visa card. Because one, it will be more secure, it'll be more easy to use. Everything will be a one-click on board into a service. You won't we can actually use these technologies to create the future we always wanted to live in, where one, we have full control over our identity. It's not stored in some centralized database, yet we still have the mechanism to create webs of trust, figure out how to trust each other on the internet, know you are who you say you are, therefore have transactions that can even potentially have recourse. And I think one thing that I'm predicting, and people's mileage will vary on this, is the emergence of layer 3 payment protocols. So I view, so obviously we all know that Bitcoin is layer 1, and Lightning is layer 2. I think we're eventually going to reach a point where we have like more recourse-based protocols that can provide a lot of the benefits that credit cards do today, where yes, you can reverse a payment if someone defrauds you, or they don't provide services, or there's like non-delivery of goods, because this is like a real problem, right? Like if you do something like buy, I don't know, like a diamond ring online, and you charge, and let's say you send someone like $7,000 of Bitcoin, and you sit there and wait, and a month goes by, you send an email, my ring hasn't arrived. Like there's no recourse, right?
But how do you arbitrate that?
I think we're going to have trust protocols. Like, look, how does it work today? The way it works today is we have these systems of social trust. We're not even aware that they're there, right? Like why do we trust Amazon is going to deliver boxes to our house, like based on like what we enter in there? Well, it's for social trust reasons. We socially trust them because we know all of our friends use Amazon and it's worked out, and we read in the news that like Amazon does, and we build up in our mind all of these like puts and takes about like what to trust in life, and there's more puts there than takes, and so we trust Amazon. And what we need to do is we need to like be able to have that for the digital realm, like for Bitcoin. And the way we do that with things like verifiable credentials is we can literally do the same thing, where you can have a digital identity, I can have a digital identity, or a company can have a digital identity, and then it can have verifiable credentials where other trusted actors in the system vouch for each other. And we can cryptographically verify we're dealing with who we are. And once we do that, we can actually have lower risk transactions where it doesn't necessarily have to be a layer 1 transaction or even a layer 2 transaction, where it can be more like just a pure net settlement layer through escrow services, where people will accept that sort of thing because, one, like that's the only way people will do these things, because otherwise they won't buy from, they'll choose to buy from online vendors that use layer 3 payments versus other payment mechanisms where it's just too easy to defraud them. And people get all upset at me. I was on a,
well, it's against what Satoshi said in pretty much the first paragraph of the white paper.
Yeah, no, it is. But here's the problem, right? And this is what I said. And I got into a pretty big debate on someone pulled me into a conversation recently. It was like on a Twitter Spaces or something. And I really got into it. And my argument here is that if there is no recourse, then the rate of fraud is simply part of the transaction costs. So if 5% of all of your Bitcoin gets misappropriated, misdirected, like for, non-delivery of goods or your failure to provide services, it'll probably be higher than 5% in a world where there's no recourse. That's like more expensive than credit card exchange today.
Yeah, but don't we have the fact that within the current system where you can have transactions reversed, there is a different fraud that happens there, and that's also part of the transaction cost. So don't we have it better this way?
I think it's more that people will choose the payments layer that reflects what's at stake.
Okay, so you could have the reverse one or you could have the anarchist one.
Yeah, so if you're, for example, if you're moving, $100 million worth of Bitcoin to settle some major international settlement, you're going to want to do it like on layer one, right? You're not going to screw around with some crazy system where there could be a chargeback. But if you're buying a coffee where there's very little at stake, where the actual risk of like a chargeback or being defrauded over that is de minimis, like the business would lose pennies, but the extra customers it might get because of the lower risk to the customer it more than makes up for it. And I think those transaction costs end up being much, much lower. And so I think what we're going to see is like multiple layers of payments where what's at stake in the transaction is going to determine whether or not someone feels safe doing a layer 1, layer 2, or layer 3 transaction. I think layer 1 is like it's final settlement, and everyone doesn't need that, which is why we have Lightning. And Lightning is where we can have non-reversible P2P transactions. It's incredibly low risk, where you still don't need that much trust because it's really hard to screw the other person over. But then we're going to have a third layer, which I believe are going to be trust protocols, where social trust is something that we rely on very heavily to create efficient economic transactions. And the nice thing about this new world is, unlike this world today, right? Like we basically are at level 3 today, like at layer 3 today with all of our debit cards and credit cards around the world. And there's no way for us to get down to a layer 2 or a layer 1 scenario today. But in this world, we'll just be able to do that.
Yeah.
We'll just be able to drop down to layer 1 when it's important to us, when we need to know that we have the money in hand and there's no one can screw us over. And so I think it's going to be, like that. And I think TBD is starting to work on things that I think exist more in that layer 3 world. And I think that is necessary to solve a lot of these problems, because chargeback fraud is very real. And you don't have to tell me about it. I work for a company that deals with it every single day. However, like there's another side to it. Like people do like get taken for a ride. Like I've ordered things online before that never showed up, and it was really good that I was able to call my bank and say like, well, the thing I just paid $2,000 for, it just actually I once bought something off of eBay, and they sent me a box and it was literally empty inside. So I was like, I saw the FedEx thing, it's like on its way. So like they completely like took me for a ride. And I think people are still going to want to have recourse payments, and recourse payments are going to be appropriate for the vast majority of low stakes economic transactions. You're not going to want to have recourse payments if you're buying a house or a car. If you're sitting at a car dealership, you're probably going to do probably a layer 2 or a layer 1 transaction. How
does that work though in terms of chargeback fraud? Will I also, in my identity, it will show if I'm somebody who's regularly requesting my money back? How does that actually work in the reality?
In reality, it's just a delayed settlement. It's an escrow, like delayed settlement mechanism.
But who arbitrate? How do we arbitrate whether I received my box or not?
There's going to be companies. There's going to be a business. Recourse payments, like maybe that's where Visa and MasterCard will pivot their businesses in the future. Like and they'll find some business model to do that. That's how I view it. And I think maybe they'll figure out ways to continue to have some sort of customer loyalty program, or maybe some businesses will actually pay some small nominal fee to be part of their payment network or part of their marketplaces or their discovery networks. And that's how those things will happen. But I believe those things will happen because I think the demand is there and the potential for fraud is just very, very high. But I do think that like the difference between that and what we have today is the layer 1 and layer 2 is always there. You can always use it.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty fucking rad.
Like that's the cool thing is like no one will ever be stuck at layer 3. They'll always be able to say, you know what, I want my money in my wallet and I want it now. And I think that's what's going to keep the system honest. But I do think that I do think that layer 3 is the next step.
All right. Well, I'm yet to be convinced on that one. All right. Let's talk about FTX and we'll finish out.
Okay.
How did you take that all in this week? Because it's pretty fucking awful.
Look, I have long believed that, it comes down to what we were just talking about. Like if we're without utility, like this is all nonsense. It's just a casino. It's just a casino. And that's what I think this is. I think that we're seeing, the reality is that like a whole bunch of easy money, a lot of it pandemic related, actually. Like I think a lot of people took their stimulus checks and went and bought a bunch of, these ridiculous cryptocurrencies with them. And everything was up and to the right. And we saw a classic bubble form and the bubble started to pop, and we're seeing the reckoning of that. And I've expected that, right? I mean, I've been saying this for a long time that I think that there's a lot of mania here. I said it on several podcasts like months ago that I thought that there's way too much froth in this market. And I totally expect that there's going to be some shoe that drops at some point. I didn't know when it would happen. It turns out it happened, 4 or 5 months later, but I'm not surprised. 2, I'm very angry because I know a lot of innocent people are getting hurt by this. And it upsets me that, and 3, it upsets me that I feel like a lot of us are going to get painted with that brush, even though we were trying very, very hard to not be that. We were trying really, really hard to work on what we saw as what was important, which was leveraging these technologies to build utility for people who are unserved by the financial system, underserved by the financial system, or in the case of what's happening around the world in some of these authoritarian countries, like providing a life or death tool to people to be able to literally survive. And so I saw it like that, and it's really, really sad that we're going to have our work cut out for us over the the coming months and years to continue to educate people on the fact that Satoshi's vision, like a P2P payment system of Bitcoin, is not the same thing as a big giant casino of thousands and thousands of these tokens that who even knows what they were originally meant for. Were simply just, there's no other way to put it, right? Like it was just, it's hard to even compare it to like a casino, because at least the casino, like you have some sense of like what the odds are and stuff, and there's like some sets of rules, but it was just tulips. That's all it was. It was tulips.
Well, I actually think now that's a very profound way to end this. So I salute you, Mike Brock. I really enjoyed this.
I enjoyed it too.
I hope you can come back on the show sometime soon. Jeremy's going to be really pissed off I didn't push you on the DIDs, but fuck Jeremy. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Jeremy.
I've really enjoyed following you on Twitter. I enjoy your work. I think everything you're doing over at TB. When are you going to get a name?
It's our name.
That's just a dad joke. All right, listen, you take care. Anything you need, give me a shout. And yeah, hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.